part 4 about Tom Crean. In part 3, I mentioned on the 4th of January 1912, Crean, Lashley, and Teddy Evans were told by Scott to head back to Cape Evans because he believed they wouldn't be able to get to the South Pole. But the main issue here, all of these men must get back before the weather gets worse. So it's a race for their lives. How far is Cape Evans from the polar plateau for Crean, Lashley, and Teddy Evans? 750 miles. And with whatever supplies Scott and his team can spare given to the 3 men while the 5-man team is going to the South Pole, the 3 men would need to find depots on the way back. Otherwise, it isn't the freezing temperatures they are going to be worried about. So, the journey back is in 3 stages. Stage 1, 230 miles across the 10,000-foot high plateau. Stage 2, 120 miles down the crevice of Beardmore. Stage 3, 400 miles across the ice barrier. And unlike Scott, Evans had no qualms telling his 2 comrades the danger of this journey. But these 3 men didn't have a choice. They must get back to the camp, and they will have to rely on each other if they are going to survive. The 3 men started trekking northwards, and for now the weather was on their side. The men were traveling for 10 hours by harness. Teddy Evans realized if the 3 of them had to eat a full day's rations, they must travel 17 miles a day during the 230 miles across the plateau. Apparently, Teddy Evans was stealing time by setting his watch forward by an hour each morning, but then put it back to normal at the end of the day, while hoping he had fooled the 2 men. But apparently, Tom Crean and Lashley knew this and didn't say anything to Teddy Evans because they knew the importance of this ruse. At this point, the men were hauling 400 pounds on the sledge. The men made good progress, but then they were hit with an early blizzard and found it difficult to breathe while being 10,000 feet above sea level. But the 3 men came across their abandoned skis on the 6th of January, and with it they did a fair better process with a 19 miles journey in 1 day. But 2 men, Crean and Teddy Evans, got snow blindness. But Teddy came up with a remedy to help with this ailment by easing the burning feeling on the eyes by bandaging them with poultice with old tea leaves. The men kept marching in silence and speaking very little. Maybe because they had very little to say to each other. But with the temperatures reaching as far as minus 29 degrees and wind blowing into faces like constant jab of frozen needle points, as Teddy Evans remarked, the men had got lost in the bad weather, and Teddy Evans on the 13th of January calculated they were miles, of course, at Shackleton Ice Falls, just 2,000 feet above Beardmore. And Teddy was concerned it would take 3 days of a detour to the ice falls to get onto Beardmore. But with supplies running low, they couldn't afford any day wasted, so Teddy Evans came up with a drastic plan. The 3 men had to get on board the sledge and glide down the ice falls. Apparently, Lashley bowed to Teddy's authority. Crean, on the other hand, apparently said, Captain Scott would never do a damn fool thing like that. And Evans apparently retorted, "Well, Captain Scott is not here, so get on board." The conversation ended quickly, and they began their descent. Teddy Evans later wrote, "We encountered fall after fall, bruises, cuts, and abrasions were sustained, but we vied with one another in bringing all our grit and patience to bear. Scarcely a complaint was heard, although one or the other of us would be driven almost sick with pain as the sledge cannoned into this or that man's heel with a thud that made the victim clench his teeth to avoid crying out." The three men came across a very steep slope and sped 60 miles per hour, but were lucky no severe injuries happened. But they made it down to Beardmore. On the 14th of January, Lashley, Teddy Evans, and Tom Crean came across Mount Darwin Depot and replenished supplies and food. And by the 16th of January, they did a good 18 or 20 miles day march. The weather improved, but the travel was slow and heavy. On the 17th of January, Scott and his team finally reached the South Pole. But as they saw, Amundsen bet them by a month. Back to Crean, Teddy Evans, and Lashley, the three men had to go through at this point a labyrinth of passageways and crevices, hoping the weather wouldn't break. Eventually, the three men came across a crevice they must cross, and they must cross it, because the next depot was vital. So, they went across the bridge of hard snow, well knowing whether the hard snow would take their weight, but they didn't have a choice. Ashley crossed first, but he was so concerned about the bridge, he didn't walk upright. Instead, Ashley sat on the side of it, moving very carefully. Eventually, the other two joined Ashley and carefully pulled the sledge. After this point, the men were realizing how weak they were getting and how much rest they needed. But there was no place to put up the tent. Teddy Evans elected himself to find a route out, but the other two men were worried Evans might get lost or hurt. But Evans held a feeling of responsibility to Lashley and Crean. So Teddy went to find the route, and he did. And they weren't far from Mid Glacier Depot. On January 21st, the three men came across Lower Glacier Depot, and they were tired and relieved when they came across it. And a day later, they were at the barrier. Tears of joy came over them. From here, it was to be pretty straightforward, back to the camp. But Teddy Evans was showing signs of scurvy. He was feeling stiffness at the back of the knee and loose bowels. Crean was suffering from diarrhea, and Lashley giddy and faint. The progress was slow, and it was 400 miles to Cape Evans. Lashley assumed the role as doctor and gave Teddy Evans a mixture of opium pills and chalk. But Teddy Evans' legs were swollen and olive green in color. On 25th of January 1912, the men were still hauling across the barrier, but Amundsen was already back at Framheim camp and asking, was there coffee on the stove? And while it was 99 days from the pole and back for the three men, it was over 100 days on the 30th of January, and Teddy Evans was being gloomy and pessimistic, just when morale needed to be important and for the men to pull through. But on the 3rd of February, Teddy Evans broke down. Lashley wrote, "This morning we were forced to put Mr. Evans on his ski and strap him on, as he could not lift his legs. They are rapidly getting worse. Things are looking very serious on his part." But even Lashley was depressed, and they struggled to the depot at Mount Hooper. Crean was concerned about his comrades. Evans was getting worse, and Lashley, who normally was calm, is now struggling. It was 180 miles to Hut Point, and while it was grueling, Crean was also looking back to see any sign of Scott and the other four men. But no sign. But there is a bigger problem. Evans is rapidly going downhill, and without a proper diet, even the strength of Lashley and Crean were finding it difficult to man-haul the sledge. So on the 7th of February, the men threw most of the gear out of the sledge to make it more easier to haul it. They were 100 miles away from Hut Point, but one morning Teddy Evans collapsed, and they thought he died. Crean wept, and Evans mentions in his diary, "The tears from Crean were warm," and Teddy Evans gave a weak laugh. But the three men knew at this point they were losing the race for their life. So they threw more stuff out of the sledge, and all they kept on the sledge was a tent, sleeping bag, a little bit of food, and cooking oil. But they were still managing 10 miles a day, hauling and marching for the 10 hours. Teddy Evans, knowing of the grave situation of their predicament, asked his two comrades to leave him behind. The two men rejected his suggestion. At this point, they were 83 miles from Hut Point, and the two men, Lashley and Crean, feared going to sleep in case Teddy Evans didn't wake up. And on the 16th of February, they cut their rations by half. With 40 miles away from Hut Point, only 4-day rations of food remained. With Crean and Lashley doing the work of three men, hauling the sledge with Evans on it 10 miles a day, the two men are finding it difficult, but still they push on. On the 17th of March, the men camp, and hoping for a miracle, a dog team would come across them. While on the same day, 400 miles away, near the foot of Beardboard, the five-man team, led by Scott, sadly lost a teammate. Tom Crean's friend, Taff Evans. He collapsed and died. On the morning of the 18th, the men woke up, but with 35 miles left, they knew it was over for them. But still, Crean and Lashley tried to get Evans on the sledge, and they collapsed. Worried Teddy Evans had died. Crean, once again, going to weep when Lashley basically told Crean there's no time to cry and to help him getting Evans onto the sledge. They gave Evans brandy to try to revive him and help him on to the sledge and make him as comfortable as possible, while knowing This is Evans' last march. But this would be it. The two men couldn't pull the sledge any further, so they pitched up the tent and carried Evans inside. Lashley and Crean had a discussion outside the tent, but Evans overheard the conversation. Lashley offered to go to get help and Crean would look after Evans, but Crean disagreed and offered to go instead, and Lashley would be better to look after Evans. It was agreed by Lashley, and Crean set off to Hut Point to get help for the two men, especially more for Evans. And with whatever supplies were spare for Crean, with 3 biscuits and 2 sticks of chocolate, joined Tom Crean 35 miles rescue mission to find help from Hut Point, falling on the ice, going through the long route since Cape Umbridge wasn't frozen enough with slush and ice, and threat of falling from the crevice, which Lashley found a note from the mechanic warning of the crevice. Crean made it, and as he was looking down at the hut from Observation Hill, no sign of activity. You can imagine the feeling of disappointment Crean must have felt. 35 miles, nearly 18 hours of journey to Hut Point, and no sign of anyone. He knows he has to keep going to keep Evans, but Cape Evans is another 14 or 15 miles away. So Crean goes down to Hut Point, and with the blizzard coming, he goes there to settle. But a feeling of joy may have filled up in Crean because he saw dogs and sledge out at the sea ice. So there must be someone at Hut Point. He stumbled in the hut and fell to his knees, numbed with the cold, exhausted, and hungry. Inside the hut was the Russian Dmitri and the Dr. Atkinson, and blurted out to them about his comrades. After being revived by Atkinson, Crean requested to be one of the rescuers, but Atkinson refused. But nothing could be done till the blizzard passed, which it did eventually on the 20th of February. The rescuers set out to rescue Lashley and Evans, which they did, because Lashley torn up an old green piece of coating, and when the rescuers arrived with the dogs, one of them stopped outside the tent, and a grey Siberian dog stuck their head through the tent flap, licked the hands and face of Evans, and Evans, hiding his emotions, grabbed the dog's ears and sank the face into the mane of the Siberian dog. Atkinson eventually tended to the two men, giving them fresh vegetables, fruit, and seal meat, and then prepared to bring them back to Hut Point. When they did return, Crean was delighted to see his comrades, but it wasn't long when Crean was concerned about Scott and his team, who had more of a distance than the 3 men, which they were going to the South Pole but had to make their way back. And with the temperatures decreasing and winter starting to set in, it will be more of a challenge for Scott and his remaining team to get back safely. But the challenge started immediately on the 5th of January. So now we are going to take a look at Scott and his 5-man team at this point, fighting for their life. Scott wrote, cooking for 5 takes a seriously longer time than cooking for 4, perhaps half an hour on the whole day. It is an item I had not considered when reorganizing. The surface was indomitable. The snow was clogging and soft and made hauling the sledge difficult. On the 7th of January, temperatures were minus 20 degrees Celsius, and they only traveled 5 miles in 4 hours. Scott, at this point, found out about Evans' injury, and Bowers, who had short legs, sank into the snow, and without the skis, it could be harder for him to trudge through the snow, which it was. On 14th of January, Scott noticed Oates was feeling cold and fatigued more than the rest of the team. Eventually, the five-man party reached the pole but lost the race. Emerson and his team beaten them. The men deflated. Oates took the defeat too bad, and while expecting the hut Amundsen and his team erected, they found record of the Norwegian achievement and a letter for Scott. Scott is a naval man of the British Royal Navy, and he was asked in the letter to go to King Haakon VII of Norway to deliver him a letter of Amundsen achievement. Also, Amundsen left a surplus of supplies for Scott and his men. So the Union Jack was placed on the pole, a few photos taken, and on the 18th of January, the five-man team turned their back on the pole and headed back home to base camp. While on the journey back, on the 23rd of January, the temperatures was minus 34 degrees, and Scott reported Taft Evans was a good deal run down. While on the 29th, food was a problem because the men were not eating enough for the hard labor of hauling the sledge, and while doing this, they were getting hungrier and hungrier. But that wasn't the only problem. Scott was noticing the physical and mental capacity of the men. Like Wilson had strained a tendon on his leg, and Taft Evans losing two of his fingernails to frostbite, and to Scott's shock, Taft was also seemed to be losing his heart. But also on the 4th of February, Taft Evans fell through a shallow crevice. Obviously survived, but Scott wasn't the only person to have noticed something was wrong. Oates wondered if Taft would make it back to base. Wilson believed it was concussion because of the fall in the crevice, which might have caused a brain hemorrhage. Or it could have been scurvy, or both. But all in all, Taft Evans' health was deteriorating, and he took the loss of the race to the pole to heart. Because apparently he wanted out of the Navy and to make a living as a famous explorer. On the 16th, Evans couldn't do anything. And on the 17th of February 1912, Petty Officer Edgar Evans, the strongest man of the team, died. Although, as Scott mentions, it was a very terrible day, the men have to press on to build more. The four men arrived at Champeau's camp and feasted on supplies, and with their strength back, they pressed on the 400-mile slog across the barrier. On the 19th, the men covered 4.6 miles, but still they defiantly plodded along till they came across a hurdle. No oil at the depots, which they would be able to heat the food or warm their drink. Now, in the month of March, and 300 miles to go, the temperatures kept plummeting to minus 41 degrees, and with progress slowed to 1 mile an hour, the men obligated themselves to keep on the march for 10 hours to reach the next depot. But another problem came for the men. Oates' feet had severe frostbite, and while hauling supplies was making them hungry and putting on their gear took half an hour, the progress was getting slow. On the 7th of March, Amundsen, on his ship Fram, sailed to Tasmania. Oates was deteriorating, and he wasn't able to get into the harness to manhole, and he asked Wilson of his condition. Will he pull through? Wilson lied and said, I don't know. Scott was calculating how many days of food they had. 7 days and 55 miles to one ton camp. Winter arrived and the weather plummeted further to minus 42 degrees. The condition on Oates was getting worse, and he offered himself to be left behind, just as Teddy Evans offered. And just like Crean and Lashley, Scott Bowers and Wilson refused. But when Scott told Oates that he was going to leave the tent just to do something, just to venture out, looking for something, Lawrence was left in the tent. And Lawrence Edward Grace Oates, on his 32nd birthday, 17th of March 1912, died. We're 25 to 30 miles away from one ton camp, and on the 19th, the weather being minus 40 degrees and Scott's feet now being a concern, the three men stumbled forward about 4.5 miles. They are now 11 miles off one ton camp and battered with a severe blizzard. The men only had 2 days of food left, and with fuel ran out and the blizzard battering their green tents for the rest of the week. Scott's final entry, 29th March 1912. Every day we have been ready to start for our depot 11 miles away. But outside the door of the tent it remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for any better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. Or Scott. Last entry. For God's sake, look after our people. Robert Falcon Scott, 43. Edward Adrian Wilson, 39. And Henry Robertson Bowers, 28. Slán.